when Margaret Calloway stepped off the stagecoach with her left sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder, rancher Josiah Trent didn't gasp or stare like the townsfolk gathering to witness his mail-order bride's arrival. Instead, he lifted his own empty right sleeve and smiled for the first time in 2 years, whispering, "Thank God now we're even." The ranch house door creaked on its hinges as Margaret stepped across the threshold, her traveling dress dusty from the long journey, and Josiah noticed immediately how she turned her body to pull the door closed with her right hand while balancing her carpet bag against her hip with practiced ease that spoke of years adapting to her condition. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as he watched her survey the simple main room with its stone fireplace and worn but clean furniture, neither of them quite meeting the other's eyes as the weight of their unusual arrangement settled between them like dust motes in the amber light. Josiah moved to take her bag but stopped awkwardly when he realized his missing right arm meant he'd have to cross in front of her to grab it with his left. And Margaret noticed his hesitation, setting the bag down herself with a small smile that suggested she understood the dance of accommodation they would both be learning. The kitchen was next, and he observed how she ran her hand along the counter edges, memorizing the layout while her eyes catalogued where everything was stored, and when she reached for the water pitcher to pour herself a drink, she did it with such fluid motion that he barely noticed she was doing the work of 2 hands with one. They stood there in his kitchen, 2 strangers bound by letters and circumstance, and finally Margaret broke the silence by saying she'd lost her arm 3 years ago, when a new mechanical loom at the textile factory where she worked had malfunctioned, catching her sleeve and pulling her in before anyone could hit the emergency stop, and the doctors said she was lucky to survive at all. Josiah found himself nodding and sharing his own story about the harvest day, when the threshing machine's belt snapped and wrapped around his arm, how he'd spent 6 months learning to write with his left hand, and longer than that learning to accept the pitying looks from folks in town. Margaret surprised him then by laughing, not mockingly but with genuine understanding, as she admitted that getting dressed in the morning had become a 20-minute ordeal until she'd learned to lay everything out the night before in the exact order she needed, and Josiah found himself chuckling too, as he confessed he'd given up on anything with more than 3 buttons after spending an hour one morning fighting with a dress shirt. The tension that had filled the room began to dissipate as they compared strategies for daily tasks, Margaret demonstrating how she could tie an apron one-handed by using her teeth for the final pull, while Josiah showed her the modified tools he'd created with extended handles that could be braced against his body for leverage. As evening approached and they prepared a simple meal together, each automatically adjusting their movements to give the other space to work, Josiah realized that for the first time since his accident, he was with someone who didn't see him as broken but simply as different. And Margaret seemed to sense the same recognition in him, their mutual understanding forming the first delicate threads of what might become a remarkable partnership. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. The morning air carried a chill that made Margaret pull her shawl tighter with her one good arm as she and Josiah entered Henderson's general store, the bell above the door announcing their arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock the sudden silence that fell over the assembled townspeople, who turned to stare with the kind of naked curiosity usually reserved for circus, oddities or public hangings. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose tongue was sharper than any knife in her husband's inventory, stood behind the counter with her arms crossed and her lips pursed as if she'd just bitten into something sour, while near the pickle barrels Tommy Morrison, no more than 8 years old, pointed directly at Margaret's pinned sleeve and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that the new lady was missing parts just like Mr. Trent. His mother, Sarah Morrison, gasped and yanked the boy's arm down with such force he yelped, but the damage was done, and the whispers spread through the store like wildfire through dry grass, each person pretending to examine goods while stealing glances at the unusual couple who dared to shop together as if they were normal folks. Josiah felt heat rise in his neck as he heard someone near the fabric bolts whisper something about two halves, and he started to turn toward Margaret to suggest they leave, but she was already moving forward with her chin raised and her back straight as a fence post, approaching the counter where Mrs. Henderson waited with barely concealed disapproval. The store owner's wife didn't even pretend to be polite as she looked Margaret up and down before declaring in a voice meant to carry that it was a shame when desperate people made desperate choices and that two halves could never make a proper whole, no matter how hard they might try to pretend otherwise. Josiah stepped forward, ready to defend Margaret with whatever authority his position as a property owner might carry. But Margaret placed her hand gently on his arm to stop him, then turned to Mrs. Henderson with a smile so sweet it could have been poured over flapjacks. Strange how folks with two good arms can still be so useless with their mouths, Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the store. And I've noticed that having all your limbs doesn't prevent someone from being half-witted, present company being the perfect example of that particular affliction. The store went so quiet you could hear the flour dust settling on the shelves, and Mrs. Henderson's face turned 3 shades of red before purple began creeping in at the edges. But Margaret wasn't finished, as she calmly began listing the supplies they needed, speaking to Mr. Henderson, who had appeared from the back room as if nothing had happened. The other customers slowly returned to their shopping, though the whispers continued with a different tone now, one that suggested perhaps they had underestimated this one-armed woman who could deliver a verbal slap with more force than most people could manage with both hands, and Josiah found himself fighting to hide a grin as he helped gather their purchases, proud of Margaret's strength and wondering what other surprises she might have in store. The storm hit just after midnight with the kind of fury that made grown men pray and cattle panic. Thunder rolling across the valley like cannon fire while lightning split the sky into jagged pieces, and Josiah woke to the sound of splintering wood and bellowing cattle as his herd crashed through the weakened section of fence he'd been meaning to repair for weeks. He struggled into his boots and coat with the frustrated movements of a man still learning to dress quickly with one hand, while Margaret was already at the window watching the chaos unfold, her calm assessment cutting through his panic, as she noted the cattle were heading toward the box canyon rather than scattering across open range. Traditional methods would require roping and turning the lead steers, but Josiah knew with bitter certainty that he couldn't handle a lasso properly with one arm, and most of the scattered herd was already beyond reach, their shapes barely visible through the driving rain that turned the ground into a muddy mess that would make horsework treacherous. Margaret turned from the window with a look of determination that reminded him of generals he'd seen in old war photographs, and said they didn't need to catch the cattle, they just needed to guide them. And she'd noticed that the natural slope of the land created a funnel toward the canyon if they could block off the 2 side trails with the portable gate sections stored in the barn. The plan she outlined was elegantly simple, using the storm and terrain to their advantage rather than fighting against it, and Josiah felt a spark of hope as he realized she was right, that their limitations had forced them to see a solution that desperation might have hidden from someone trying to solve it with brute force alone. They worked through the storm with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible a week ago, Margaret on horseback using her remarkable skill to position herself at key points where her mere presence would turn the cattle toward the canyon, while Josiah dragged the gate sections into place with his good arm, bracing them with rocks and posts in a design that Margaret shouted through the rain. The system they developed in those desperate hours was born from necessity but refined by intelligence, with Margaret calling out positions like a chess master moving pieces while Josiah executed the physical placement, neither able to do both tasks but together creating something that worked better than traditional methods might have. When the last steer trotted into the box canyon and Josiah swung the final gate closed, they stood there in the rain, soaked and muddy but triumphant, and Margaret laughed with pure joy at what they'd accomplished, not in spite of their missing arms, but because those very limitations had forced them to think beyond conventional solutions. The next morning, when neighboring ranchers arrived to help with what they assumed would be a scattered herd across 3 counties, they found every single head of cattle safely contained and grazing in the canyon, and Josiah overheard Sam Cooper tell his son that maybe there was something to be learned from folks who had to find new ways to solve old problems. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Margaret and Josiah worked side by side replacing the broken fence posts, the rhythm of their labor having found a natural cadence over the past days where she would hold the post steady while he drove it deep with the sledgehammer, neither speaking much as sweat rolled down their faces and soaked through their work clothes. Margaret had been quieter than usual all morning, and Josiah noticed how she kept glancing toward the horizon as if expecting unwanted visitors, her nervous energy manifesting in the way she attacked each task with unnecessary vigor until finally she stopped mid-swing of clearing brush and said there was something she needed to tell him about why she'd really answered his advertisement. The words came out in a rush as she explained that her late husband Edward had been heir to the Thornton shipping empire based out of St. Louis, that she'd married him 4 years ago when she still had both arms and he was already dying of consumption, though neither of them knew how little time they'd have before the factory accident that took her arm and the carriage accident that took his life happened within 6 months of each other. She reached into her saddlebag with trembling fingers and produced a leather portfolio containing legal documents that bore official seals and signatures, spreading them on a flat rock so Josiah could see the will that left her Edward's third of the family business and the letters from lawyers confirming her inheritance was legitimate and binding, despite what his brothers claimed about her being mentally unfit to manage such assets. The Thornton brothers, she continued with bitterness creeping into her voice, had tried everything to steal her inheritance, first offering to buy her out for pennies on the dollar, then threatening legal action claiming she'd manipulated their dying brother, and finally attempting to have her declared incompetent and institutionalized when they realized the courts wouldn't overturn Edward's will just because they wanted the money. Josiah studied the documents with growing anger as he recognized the same kind of legal manipulation that powerful families used to destroy anyone they saw as weak or vulnerable. And when Margaret explained how she'd been forced to flee across 3 territories with the brothers' hired men following her trail, his jaw tightened with a fury he hadn't felt since before his accident. "So you came here thinking a broken rancher couldn't protect you," he said quietly, the words carrying an edge that made Margaret look up sharply from where she'd been studying her boots, and for a moment he wondered if she'd seen him as just another easy mark to manipulate. But Margaret met his eyes directly with that steady gaze he'd come to admire, and replied without hesitation that she'd come here thinking a broken rancher would understand what it means to be underestimated, to have people look at you and see only what's missing instead of what remains, to know that the world wants to push you aside, and take what's yours simply because they think you're too damaged to fight back. The truth of her words hit him like cold water, washing away his momentary doubt as he realized that she hadn't chosen him despite his disability, but because of their shared understanding of what it meant to be deemed less than whole by a world that measured worth in limbs and conventional capability. And he found himself reaching for her hand with his good one, squeezing it gently as he promised they would face whatever came next together. The dust cloud appeared on the eastern road just after breakfast on a Tuesday that had started with deceptive calm, and Margaret's face went pale as she recognized the expensive cut of the lead rider's coat even from a distance, whispering that the Thorntons had finally found her as she watched 4 men approach with the deliberate pace of those who believed the law was on their side. William Thornton dismounted first, his perfectly polished boots somehow remaining clean despite the dusty ride, followed by his younger brother Charles and a nervous-looking man wearing a sheriff's badge from somewhere back east, while the 4th man remained mounted and watchful like hired muscle ready for trouble. William surveyed the ranch with the dismissive glance of someone calculating property values before his gaze settled on Josiah, deliberately looking past Margaret, as if she were no more significant than a fence post, and when he spoke his voice carried the cultured tones of Eastern education mixed with barely concealed contempt for everything frontier. "Surely you understand she's not capable of making rational decisions in her condition," William said to Josiah while gesturing vaguely toward Margaret without actually acknowledging her presence, his tone suggesting he was speaking to another rational man about handling an inconvenient problem rather than discussing a human being standing right there. The younger Thornton brother added with false concern that they only wanted what was best for poor Margaret, that she needed proper medical attention and supervision that a remote ranch couldn't provide, especially given her obvious physical limitations and the trauma she'd endured, though his eyes kept drifting toward the legal documents he knew she carried. Josiah let them finish their rehearsed speeches before responding with a coldness that could have frozen water in July, saying it seemed to him that Margaret had made the perfectly rational decision to get away from men who thought they could steal her inheritance by declaring her incompetent, and that any fool could see she was more capable with one arm than the Thorntons were with their full set of limbs and fancy education combined. The sheriff, a thin man named Deputy Marshal Collins, who kept fidgeting with his badge, as if uncertain of his authority this far from familiar territory, cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps they should wait for local legal representation since his jurisdiction was questionable at best, and he wasn't comfortable making arrests based solely on the Thorntons' claims without proper territorial authorization. William's face darkened with frustration as he realized his carefully planned ambush was falling apart. But before he could argue, Margaret finally spoke with quiet dignity, stating that she welcomed any legal examination of her mental fitness and financial records, provided it was conducted by legitimate territorial authorities, rather than men who'd been paid to deliver a predetermined verdict. The standoff stretched taut as the morning sun climbed higher, and William finally agreed through gritted teeth to wait for the territorial judge to arrive from the county seat, though he warned that they would be watching the ranch to ensure Margaret didn't flee again, a threat that Josiah countered by noting that any trespassers on his property would be dealt with according to frontier law rather than Eastern sensibilities. As the Thorntons rode away to establish camp just beyond the property line, Margaret turned to Josiah with a mixture of fear and determination, knowing they had perhaps 3 days to prepare their defense against men who had unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. The 3 days following the Thorntons' arrival became a whirlwind of strategic community engagement as Margaret and Josiah set out to transform their neighbors' perception from pity to respect. Beginning when the schoolmarm, Miss Patterson, fell ill with a fever, and Margaret volunteered to manage the classroom despite several parents' initial protests about having a disabled woman teach their children. Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse early that first morning, carrying lesson materials she'd prepared the night before, and within an hour had captivated even the most skeptical students with her ability to write complex mathematical equations on the board while simultaneously explaining the logic behind them, her single hand moving with a grace that made the children forget she was missing anything at all. Word spread quickly through town about how she'd managed young Billy Henderson's tantrum with calm authority and taught the older students geometric principles using examples from fence building and cattle management that actually made sense to frontier children, and by afternoon parents were stopping by to thank her for making their children excited about learning for the first time. Meanwhile, Josiah had taken on the dangerous task of repairing the church roof that had been damaged in the last storm, a job most assumed would require at least 2 men with full use of both arms, but he'd rigged an ingenious pulley system that allowed him to haul shingles and tools up with his one good arm while maintaining his balance through careful positioning and leverage. Judge Harper, the territorial magistrate who would oversee any legal proceedings, happened to pass by the church and stopped to watch this supposed invalid working with more efficiency than the previous repair crew, and later that afternoon he made a point of visiting the schoolhouse, where he found Margaret drafting legal briefs with penmanship that would put most court clerks to shame. The judge stayed for over an hour, as Margaret walked him through her analysis of territorial law regarding competency standards and property rights, citing cases from memory and constructing arguments with the kind of logical precision that he rarely encountered, even among formally trained lawyers, all while helping young Susan Cooper with her arithmetic homework whenever the girl raised her hand. Rex Murphy, the blacksmith, initially one of the most vocal skeptics about Margaret's capabilities, changed his tune completely after she helped him solve a problem with a wagon wheel assembly that had been plaguing him for weeks, explaining the mechanical principles of load distribution and suggesting a reinforcement pattern that utilized less iron while providing greater strength. That woman knows more about leverage and mechanical advantage than most men with 2 arms, Murphy told everyone at the saloon that evening, adding that she'd probably forgotten more about engineering than he'd ever learned despite 20 years at the forge, and if the Thorntons thought she was incompetent, then they were either blind or lying. By the 3rd day, the community sentiment had shifted so dramatically that when the Thorntons appeared in town to gather witness statements supporting their case, they found doors closing in their faces and conversations stopping mid-sentence. The Frontier Solidarity closing ranks around 2 people who had proven their worth through action rather than words or paper credentials from back east. The night before the hearing arrived, with the oppressive stillness that made the ranch house feel smaller than usual, and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with legal documents spread before her like a battlefield map, her single hand trembling as she attempted to organize arguments she'd already memorized. While Josiah watched from the doorway with growing concern at the exhaustion written across her face. Without warning, she pushed the papers aside with such force that several fluttered to the floor, and when she looked up at him there were tears streaming down her cheeks as she confessed what she'd never told anyone, that Edward had been in the carriage with her during the accident that killed him, that they'd been arguing about her independence after losing her arm, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their fight had distracted the driver at the crucial moment. The words poured out between sobs as she described how Edward had been trying to convince her to accept his family's offer of permanent care in a private facility, insisting it was for her own good, and she'd been so angry at being treated like an invalid that she'd shouted at him just before the carriage hit the fallen tree, and now she carried both the guilt of surviving and the torment of their last words being harsh ones. Maybe they're right about me. Maybe I am broken, she whispered with a despair that seemed to pull all the light from the room, and not just physically but mentally and emotionally, too damaged to make rational decisions or manage my own life. And perhaps Edward would still be alive if I'd just accepted what everyone kept telling me about my limitations. Josiah crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, his own eyes glistening as he found himself sharing the darkness he'd kept buried since she'd arrived. Telling her about Sarah, the wife who'd stayed just long enough after his accident to ensure he survived before packing her things and leaving with words that still echoed in his nightmares about how she hadn't married half a man and wouldn't waste her life caring for a cripple. He described the months of drinking that followed, the nights he'd considered ending everything rather than face another day of pitying looks and his own reflection in the mirror, and how he'd finally decided to use his remaining savings to buy this remote ranch, not to build something but to hide from the world that had deemed him worthless. They sat in silence for a long moment, 2 souls laid bare in their brokenness, until Josiah reached for Margaret's hand and spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought, saying that broken things can still be useful, that sometimes they're stronger at the mended places because they know what it means to be shattered and choose to continue anyway. Margaret squeezed his hand as understanding passed between them, recognizing that their individual breaks had created edges that fit together in ways that wholeness never could have allowed, that their missing pieces had made space for each other, and that perhaps strength wasn't about being complete but about finding someone whose damage complemented your own. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they remained at that kitchen table, no longer reviewing legal arguments but simply existing together in the quiet acceptance of 2 people who had found in each other not a cure for their brokenness, but a reason to see it as something other than weakness. The courthouse was packed to capacity with curious townspeople who had arrived early to claim seats for what promised to be the most dramatic legal proceeding the territory had seen in years, the air thick with tobacco smoke, and whispered speculation as William Thornton rose from his table, with the practiced confidence of a man who had never lost a battle he'd chosen to fight. He began his argument with a theatrical gesture toward Margaret, describing her obvious physical limitations and suggesting that any woman who couldn't perform basic household tasks without assistance certainly couldn't manage complex financial affairs, painting a picture of an emotional female who had manipulated his dying brother into leaving her assets she was incapable of managing responsibly. The Eastern sheriff he'd brought testified that Margaret had fled across 3 territories rather than submit to reasonable requests for evaluation, which William argued was clear evidence of mental instability and guilt, while Charles Thornton produced affidavits from business associates in St. Louis, claiming Margaret had made erratic decisions and refused reasonable offers of help from the family. Judge Harper listened with a poker face that gave nothing away, as William concluded his opening argument by stating that the territorial court had both a legal and moral obligation to protect Margaret from herself by placing her assets under the responsible management of her late husband's family, who only wanted what was best for everyone involved. Margaret rose slowly from her chair when Harper nodded for her to respond, and despite having only one arm, she commanded the room with a presence that made several people lean forward in their seats as she began systematically destroying each of William's arguments with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. She cited Territorial Code Section 12, regarding competency standards, which required actual evidence of mental deficiency rather than physical disability, then produced her own evidence, including the ranch's financial ledgers, showing she had increased Josiah's profit margins by 30% in just 3 weeks, through improved inventory management and strategic purchasing, decisions that William's own witnesses would have to admit were brilliant if questioned. When William protested that she couldn't possibly run a household with one arm, Margaret calmly listed every meal she'd prepared, every repair she'd completed, and every improvement she'd made to the ranch since arriving, then asked William directly if he could milk a cow, mend a fence, or balance a ledger, watching with satisfaction as he spluttered about, that not being the point while the crowd chuckled at his obvious discomfort. Josiah took the stand next, and instead of offering pity or sentiment, he spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of a practical man stating simple truths, telling the court that he'd seen plenty of folks with all their limbs who couldn't do half what Margaret accomplished before breakfast, and that her physical limitation had forced her to develop problem-solving skills that made her twice as effective as most people he'd known. The blacksmith Rex Murphy testified about her engineering knowledge. Miss Patterson described her teaching abilities, and even Mrs. Henderson grudgingly admitted that Margaret had reorganized the store's inventory system in an afternoon to solve problems they'd struggled with for years, each testimony building a picture of capability that made William's claims of incompetence look increasingly desperate and false. By the time Margaret delivered her closing argument, referring to specific legal precedents and case law with a command that would have impressed any formally trained attorney, the crowd's sentiment had shifted entirely in her favor, and William Thornton's face had taken on the pale shade of a man watching his certain victory transform into humiliating defeat. Just as William Thornton began what he clearly intended to be his final triumphant summary of Margaret's supposed incompetence, the courthouse doors swung open with enough force to bang against the walls, and a weathered man in traveling clothes strode down the aisle, carrying a leather satchel that bore the marks of a long, hard journey. The man identified himself as Thomas Garrett, foreman of the Riverside textile factory where Margaret had worked before her accident, and explained that he'd traveled for 3 weeks after hearing about the case through a newspaper that had made its way east, unable to stand by while lies were told about the most brilliant mind he'd ever encountered in 30 years of factory work. Judge Harper granted him permission to testify despite William's sputtered objections about procedures and prior notice, and Garrett took the stand with the bearing of a man who had nothing to gain and everything to say about the truth of Margaret's character and capabilities. He began by describing the accident that had taken Margaret's arm, how she'd returned to the factory 6 weeks later against doctor's orders, not seeking sympathy or special treatment, but carrying blueprints for a safety mechanism she'd designed during her recovery, a device that would prevent the exact type of accident that had maimed her from ever happening again. Garrett produced a worn patent document from his satchel, officially registered in Margaret's name, describing a revolutionary automatic shut-off system that detected unusual resistance in the machinery and stopped the gears within seconds, an innovation that had already saved at least a dozen limbs in the 3 years since its implementation across multiple factories. The foreman's voice grew thick with emotion as he told the court how Margaret had refused any payment for the patent, insisting instead that it be made freely available to any factory that would install it, caring more about preventing others from suffering her fate than profiting from her pain and ingenuity. William Thornton attempted to suggest that perhaps Garrett or someone else had actually designed the device, and Margaret had simply taken credit. But Garrett laughed outright at the suggestion, producing Margaret's original sketches and calculations that showed mathematical equations and engineering principles that he admitted he could barely understand, despite 3 decades in manufacturing. The courtroom grew silent as Garrett continued, describing how Margaret had reorganized the entire factory floor workflow with one arm, creating systems that improved both efficiency and safety, how she'd taught younger workers to see machinery not as mysterious monsters, but as logical systems that could be understood and improved, and how her departure had been a loss that the factory still felt. He looked directly at the Thorntons as he concluded his testimony, stating that any man who could look at Margaret's achievements and see incompetence was either willfully blind or deliberately malicious, and that her mind was worth more than all their shipping empire regardless of how many arms she possessed. Judge Harper leaned back in his chair, studying the patent document with obvious interest, before turning his gaze to the Thorntons with an expression that suggested his patience had reached its end, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Seems to me the only disability in this courtroom is the Thorntons' ability to see past their own prejudice," he said clearly, adding that he'd seen enough evidence to determine that Margaret was not only competent but exceptional, and that any further attempts to harass her would be met with the full force of territorial law, including criminal charges for attempted theft through fraudulent claims of incompetence. Judge Harper's gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the packed courthouse as he delivered his verdict in a voice that brooked no argument, declaring Margaret fully competent in all matters legal, financial, and personal, and furthermore ordering that any continued harassment by the Thornton family would result in immediate criminal charges for conspiracy to defraud and theft by deception. The judge continued with obvious satisfaction that he had rarely seen such clear evidence of competence in any person regardless of physical condition, and that the Thorntons' attempt to use the territorial court system for their personal gain was an insult to justice that would be noted in official records for any future legal proceedings they might attempt. William Thornton's face had progressed through several shades of red to a mottled purple as he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on slate, while Charles gathered their papers with shaking hands and their Eastern sheriff looked like he wanted to disappear through the floorboards rather than be associated with this spectacular failure. The crowd in the courthouse erupted in spontaneous applause as Margaret stood to thank the judge, her single arm steady as she shook hands with those reaching out to congratulate her, and Josiah moved to stand beside her with quiet pride radiating from every line of his body as he watched his partner claim her victory. William pushed through the crowd toward the door but couldn't resist turning back for one final attempt at intimidation, hissing loud enough for those nearby to hear that no one would do business with a crippled woman regardless of what some frontier judge declared, that the real world of commerce and finance would never accept someone like her. Margaret's smile in response was radiant with a confidence that seemed to light up the entire courthouse as she replied calmly that they already were doing business with her, producing from her satchel a stack of correspondence from investors and inventors across 3 territories who had heard about her safety innovations and wanted to partner in developing adaptive equipment for disabled veterans returning from frontier conflicts. The letters represented offers of partnership and investment that totaled more than the Thorntons had tried to steal, and she explained how her experience had shown her a market that others had ignored: thousands of injured soldiers and workers who needed tools and equipment designed by someone who understood their challenges firsthand, rather than viewing them as problems to be hidden away. She had already secured contracts with 2 manufacturing companies to produce modified farming implements based on designs she and Josiah had tested on their ranch, tools that could be operated with one hand or by those with limited mobility, innovations that would open up independent living for people who had been told they were useless burdens on society. The crowd parted as the Thorntons made their humiliated exit. William's parting glare, promising that this wasn't over, despite the judge's warnings. But Margaret had already turned away to discuss with interested townspeople how they might establish a regional centre for adaptive equipment development right here in the territory. Thomas Garrett approached with tears in his eyes to congratulate her, mentioning that factories back east were already asking about her other safety innovations, and that her patent had become required study for industrial engineers who were finally beginning to understand that worker safety and productivity were connected rather than opposed concepts. As the courthouse slowly emptied and Margaret walked out into the afternoon sunlight with Josiah beside her, she realized that this victory was more than personal vindication. It was the beginning of something larger, a chance to transform disability from a source of shame into a catalyst for innovation that would change countless lives across the frontier and beyond. The morning sun caught the metal edges of the modified plow attachment as Samuel Rivers tested its weight with his remaining leg, the prosthetic wooden one he'd carved himself, providing stability while he examined the ingenious foot-operated release mechanism Margaret had designed specifically for his needs, after losing his right leg to a logging accident 2 years prior. Across the yard, Jacob Martinez worked with practiced ease despite his limited vision, running his fingers along the raised markers Josiah had installed on the feed bins that told him by touch exactly which grain mixture went to which animals, a system they developed together through weeks of trial and refinement. The ranch had transformed in 6 months from a simple cattle operation into something unprecedented on the frontier, a living laboratory where disability became the mother of innovation, where each challenge presented by missing limbs or diminished senses sparked new solutions that often proved superior to traditional methods. Margaret stood at the work table she'd designed with adjustable height settings, demonstrating to 3 visiting veterans how the new one-handed leather working tools functioned, the mechanisms utilizing foot pedals and bracing points that allowed complex tasks to be completed without requiring 2 hands to hold and manipulate materials simultaneously. The love between her and Josiah had grown from shared understanding into something deeper, manifested not in grand gestures but in the 1,000 small accommodations they made for each other, the way he automatically positioned himself on her left side so she could take his arm, the way she laid out his clothes each morning in the order that made dressing easiest for him. Their physical intimacy had developed with the same patient innovation they brought to everything else, discovering together how bodies society deemed broken could create pleasure and connection in ways that defied conventional expectations, each limitation becoming an invitation to explore new possibilities rather than mourn old ones. The network of disabled frontier folks who now corresponded with them had grown to over 50 people across 6 territories, sharing designs and modifications through letters that crisscrossed the expanding nation, creating a community of innovation that existed outside traditional channels of commerce and industry. Samuel had contributed his own design for a saddle that could be mounted and controlled with one functional leg, while Jacob had developed a system of audio cues for livestock management that was so effective even sighted ranchers were adopting it for night work or foggy conditions, The economic success of their operation had exceeded every projection, with the adaptive equipment sideline now bringing in more revenue than the cattle themselves, and orders arriving weekly from hospitals, veteran homes, and individuals who had heard about the ranch where disability meant possibility rather than limitation. Josiah watched Margaret explaining the mechanical principles behind their latest innovation to the visitors, her passion for the work evident in every gesture, and felt the familiar warmth of recognition that this woman who had arrived as a mail-order bride had become not just his partner but his equal collaborator in building something neither could have imagined alone. The ranch had 6 full-time workers now, only one of whom had all 4 limbs intact, and that was young Tom Morrison, who'd begged for a job after watching how efficiently the crew operated, saying he wanted to learn from folks who solved problems instead of just doing things the way they'd always been done. As evening approached and the visitors prepared to leave with sketches and plans for implements they could build themselves, Margaret and Josiah stood together watching the sun set over their expanded operation, understanding without words that they had created more than a successful ranch or even a happy marriage. They had built a new definition of capability that would ripple outward through the frontier for generations. The courthouse bell rang clear and bright on a September morning that carried the first hints of autumn coolness as townspeople gathered for the wedding that would have seemed impossible just months ago, filling the same benches where they had witnessed Margaret's legal victory, with faces now showing genuine celebration rather than curiosity or skepticism. Margaret stood at the entrance wearing a dress she had modified herself with hidden fasteners and strategic draping that allowed her to dress independently, while Josiah waited at the front in his best suit with the empty right sleeve pinned neatly, both of them radiating a quiet joy that needed no embellishment or pretense. Judge Harper presided with obvious pleasure at this happier occasion, remarking to those assembled that he had officiated many weddings but never one that represented such a triumph over adversity, or such a perfect example of how partnership should truly function in marriage. The ceremony proceeded with simple dignity until the moment for exchanging rings arrived, and Josiah fumbled with the gold band he had purchased with profits from their first equipment sales, his single hand trembling slightly as he tried to hold Margaret's hand steady while sliding the ring onto her finger. Without hesitation or embarrassment, Margaret reached over with her own hand to steady his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture so natural and practiced that several people in the audience found themselves wiping away tears at the perfect representation of what their union meant, not one person helping another, but 2 people supporting each other. When it came time for vows, Josiah spoke clearly despite the emotion in his voice, saying that he had advertised for a wife to help with what he couldn't do alone, but had found someone who showed him what they could build together, that Margaret had transformed his understanding of strength from something individual to something created between people who refused to let the world define their limitations. Margaret responded with her own vows about finding in Josiah not someone who overlooked her disability, but someone who understood that their missing pieces had created space for each other, that their brokenness had become the foundation for something stronger than wholeness could ever achieve. The kiss that sealed their union was brief but profound, witnessed by a community that had learned through their example that capability came in forms they had never imagined, and as the newlyweds walked back down the aisle, Samuel Rivers stood on his one good leg to salute, while Jacob Martinez played a violin by touch with more beauty than most sighted musicians could produce. The reception took place at the ranch where their adapted windmill was being installed by a crew that included 3 disabled veterans who had come specifically to see the design that used a counterweight system allowing it to be adjusted with one hand, its blades configured in a pattern that was both more efficient and more aesthetically pleasing than traditional designs. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret and Josiah stood together watching the windmill's first slow rotations, its movement graceful and steady despite, or perhaps because of its unconventional design, a perfect symbol of innovation born from necessity. The ranch stretched before them, filled with promise and purpose. the test fields for new equipment, the workshops where disabled craftsmen created solutions for problems most people never had to consider, the home where two people who had been deemed incomplete by society had built something whole and beautiful and enduring that would inspire others long after they were gone.